Ravi Kumar and Ms. Judge Navi Pillai. The next event is a much awaited panel discussion. I would like to call Mr. Raj Kumar, the moderator, to introduce the speakers and to take the lead. Few words about Mr. Raj Kumar. He's an activist, human rights defender, and an academic. He has been active with UN advocacy since 2010. I like to call Mr. Raj Kumar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Sangam to give me this opportunity. It's my privilege to be in this prestigious panel. Let me welcome first the panelists to the stage. Then afterwards, one by one, I'll go through their profile before they speak. It'll be good, rather than I go through all the profiles and then it'll be confusing for you to understand who is who. So I could kindly welcome the panelists, Dr. Nimi Gaurunathan, Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman, Ms. Heather Ryan, and Honorable Navi Pillai to the stage, please. Okay, thank you. Once again, thanks everyone. I take this opportunity to thank Sangam once again because this is my 5th year here at Sangam and it's been a privilege to run this session today. So I have a long introduction but I'm trying to cut down because most of you here are very much averse with the Sri Lankan situation. So it's fair to give enough time for the panelists. We are running late already. So I'm just going to cut down and quickly go through the outsets of it. So the absence of justice and accountability and ongoing impunity are the biggest obstacles to peace, reconciliation and sustainable political solution in the island of Sri Lanka. So the war may be over, but the ongoing conflict is there. And last 68 years, there were so many pogroms, human rights violations, different forms, continues. So the atrocity crimes committed at the end of the war and the massacres is not new to Sri Lanka. So the key question or the underlying issue is that the Sri Lankan current state or the governments, consecutive governments, don't have the political will to address impunity. So since 2009, persistence of civil society activists, fellow activists here in this room and around the world, and UN, unpoliticized leaders and NGOs, international NGOs have actually brought to this position where, despite of the UN, haven't actually saved our people during the end of the war. 150,000 or more perished. But then at least UN has started to learn some lessons. Petri report, there are other reports came out, and then certain initiatives just to protect this never repeats again in the humanity, in the face of humanity. But then the question remains, have we actually come to a brick wall in terms of accountability in Sri Lanka? How can we actually explore other avenues to take this question further? And that will be the objective of this panel today. So without further ado, I'll actually give the first speaker, which is Nimi Gaurunathan. So let's just introduce Nimi formally. So Dr. Nimi Gaurunathan is a visiting professor at Colin Powell School of Civil and Global Leadership at City College, New York. She's an advocate, human rights researcher, policy analyst, scholar, writer, and activist. And she's well known among ourselves because she has been part of Sangam for many years and have done work with this regards. So she supported a lot of many community-based organizations by living there in Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan, and have also the former director of the South Asia programs at Operation USA. As a scholar, she has examined the impact of militarizations, displacement, and sexual violence in women and political identities. So she has involved in research and peace-building missions, dialogues, and so on. Nimi still writes about women's stories to challenge the perceptions in academic and policy spaces while pulling out richness of their narratives in a non-fiction way. So her focus today is going to be more on the missing politics in transitional justice and how it's going on. And she will also lay some ground realities and situation, and then she'll go on to the missing politics of transitional justice. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I was fortunate a couple of weeks ago to give a version of this lecture to, or this talk to, University of Windsor Law School in Canada, where we had actually 10 Tamil law students who decided after we had the conversation to get involved in supporting the University of Jaffna Law School. So I do think that these conversations are very important in continuing to mobilize the next generation. So for me, talking about transitional justice and gender, that transitional justice right now in its current state feels, as someone who's not a justice scholar, that it's sort of flown in by the well-intentioned international community. And it settles onto these state structures and these political realities on the ground. And it sometimes re-entrenches these, right? And it makes them sink a little bit deeper in. And particularly when it comes to women, transitional justice can re-entrench perceptions and understandings of women. So in Sri Lanka, as elsewhere, transitional justice makes an attempt to depoliticize, right? And it operates in a way that is depoliticizing. And the way that's done very often is through gender, right? To depoliticize these processes. So in Sri Lanka, as I've seen elsewhere, there is sort of a fundamental inability for transitional justice to address violence in its pursuit of peace, right? The causes of violence get lost here. So for me, there's two conversations that I exist at the center of, both of which rely on gender. And when it comes to transitional justice, they sort of overlap. One is the conversation in the humanitarian community around sexual violence, and the other is a conversation now that's become increasingly popular on countering violent extremism. In the State Department, in the UN, that's what everybody's talking about. So the way that these two discourses frame the problem, the way that they frame women, and again, I'm carefully using this word here, but the way that they frame the victim, which is the woman, becomes very central to how useful the transitional justice process is. These two conversations frame the woman in a specific way. So a lot of my work is on identity formation, right? And so you have, in the chaos of war, you have this moment, or post-disaster, where there's all these categories, right? Particularly for women. You have combatant versus civilian. You have a war widow. You have a rape victim, right? We're continually creating these categories. We have the mothers of the disappeared, right? So we're putting women into these various categories. Now, where these are sort of legally fluid categories, for most women, they become the difference between life and death, which category they're associated with, for most Tamil women, right? And so it's very easy for these categories to attach a permanent sort of fixture to the women who are associated with them and become the only way that they can access resources, right? The only way that they can survive is by living within one of these categories. So, you know, in Sri Lanka, when you have these women in a community where citizenship itself is contested, right? Citizenship is no longer the identity. These things become more relevant because this is your only form of identity. I was recently asked to be the senior political advisor for UN Women on political rights and political voice. And one of the things I find very interesting right now at the UN is they have this framework called No One Left Behind. And what you hear in a lot of the UN conversations is that there is this description of individuals as religious minority, woman, indigenous, but it's always sort of a horizontal listing, right? It's very difficult for people to understand that you can be, let's say in Sri Lanka, a Tamil Christian, and then being a woman, having the gender part of it, makes that inequality much worse, right? So gender doesn't exist along this horizontal line. It actually deepens the impact of inequality, right? For the woman, each of those experiences become very distinct, become much deeper. And so I think in Sri Lanka right now you have this context with the Office of Missing Persons and everything happening on the ground where people are asking, and women are being asked, to choose between truth or justice, right? Rather than engage in a conversation of truth and justice. And to me and to others, it feels as if you have a victor's peace that is now leading to a victor's justice, right? And this, to me, it presents different questions. You know, will the government of Sri Lanka be willing to dig up the remains of a widow's husband, right, if that body is proof of war crimes, right? Or will they be able to just say, okay, well, we know that he's dead and he's not missing, right? It's a different set of questions that we have to operate on. So among the women, I think what I've seen and what others have seen is that you have these selective truths, right, that create their identities, and it's always based on a trauma. But the problem is that these identities, whether she's raped or whether she's a war widow, can be useful to get resources, but that becomes sort of politicked away as a type of justice in itself, right? And what I mean by that is if something terrible happens to a Tamil woman, she acknowledges that it happens, she falls into a particular category, she's given a sewing machine, and then it's done, right? That is supposed to be a form of justice. It is a type of justice that women are seeing on the island right now. But, I mean, as everybody knows, that the justice that we're looking for requires a structural change, right? So that requires asking a different question. Why was your husband targeted? When was he killed? How was he killed? How long has it been? Why has there not been an investigation? Right? These are the political conversations that have to happen for structural change. Another thing that I notice a lot in the conversations at the UN and elsewhere is that we use this sort of passive language, right? That people are alienated, people are minorities, right? But this is actually, it's a very active process. There's an alienating that goes on. There's a minoritizing that goes on, right? And so when you understand that this is an active process, again, you take the women out of these categories and you say she doesn't just exist in this category. She was pushed into these categories by these state processes of alienation, of minoritizing, right? And I think when you do that, then you don't have justice that maps onto the structure of the state. You actually have the foundations of structural inequality that start to be unearthed. We start to address the real issues of structural violence, right? So there's two women, you know, who predominantly I worked with. One would be the rape survivor, and the other is a female fighter in Sri Lanka, the women who joined the Tigers. Kate and I wrote a report recently called The Forever Victim about sexual violence in Sri Lanka, and the report essentially, after doing research on the island, a number of us, was about how sexual violence is used. How sexual violence is used to not allow women to have a political voice on the island, right? How sexual violence, and being as pervasive as it is right now, has caused women to shrink inside their houses, has changed the mobility of women, right? Again, when you don't have women in the public space, they cannot be a part of political conversations, right? It cannot happen from inside the home. So, you know, the other thing that's happened is there's been this perception that now the violence is within the Tamil community. It's no longer the military, it's within the Tamil community, right? There's a lot of research from the Congo, from elsewhere that I've, you know, been a part of work with these scholars where there's a concept of the contagion of violence, right? That the violence of the state bleeds into the private sphere. So yes, you're always going to see an increase in domestic violence when you have a context of violence for women outside. So in this truth process, you know, the truth process itself, it needs a victim, right? It always needs a victim. And women are the easiest to center here because systemically we've already learned to victimize them. We've already learned to depoliticize them through all of the ways that we engage with them. So it's really easy to center Tamil women here without allowing them a political voice, without allowing them to engage in this. And because women's issues are the ones that never challenge political issues, political agendas, right? You can say women's issues and they're not going to be a threat to anybody. They're not a threat to the government of Sri Lanka. They're not a threat to the UN. Right, if you say women's issues. So, you know, the women I've met, you get this sort of series of competing traumas, a number of things these women have been with, and they're being asked to pull one out and create this selective truth in order to get the most basic resources. That, to me, is not justice. That's not a justice process for women. And And then one activist in Sri Lanka said the role of the victimized is the only place for women to draw benefits in a context of institutional bias. Right? That's the only way women get any benefits is this association. So the other woman who I work with a lot is a female fighter, is around the world the female fighter, but in Sri Lanka with Tamil women who have fought. And this, just to comment on the other side of transitional justice is the process of demobilizing, right? The DDR process that everybody does. And in this process, again, we're trying to take this woman from damage to normal. We're trying to say she was political, let's get rid of the politics and make her normal, right? And I last year was there with these women, and you have these incredible women who have fought for the cause, who are being given beauty salons, who are being given, pastries, but they can't walk because they only have one leg and have to push a pastry cart around, right? Everything is refeminizing. Everything is the state saying, we don't want you to be political. Here, let's give you a traditional industry to engage in, and this is not, it's not what they want. So, I do a lot of work around countering violent extremism. I don't know, how much of it is relevant here, but fundamentally the issue is that women are seen as more peaceful, right? That's the way that we're looking at them. That's the way countering violent extremism looks at them. One of the things I hear all the time is that women are brainwashed, women are manipulated. They never join movements because they've thought about it, right? There was a girl in India who they caught before she joined the Islamic State, and what the interrogator kept saying was he was surprised. He kept saying, I was surprised. She had this analytical ability. She understood Sharia law, but she was able to connect Sharia law to US imperialism, to other forces going on. Right? So people are continually surprised at the intellectual engagement of women in these movements. One of the women I met recently who came here, who was in detention, she described to me the psychological process she went under, a Tamil combatant, in Sri Lanka, and it's sort of fascinating, that the psychological approach to her was, how radicalized are you? So they would ask her questions like, are you angry enough to throw this glass? Which, we should all be angry enough to throw a glass, But this is the way that they assess what her politics are. So for me, particularly with sexual violence, drawing these two things together, I always think of there's this structure when lightning hits the sand and it creates this thing, it's called a fulgurate, it's a really beautiful glass thing. But sexual violence affects women and Tamil women in such a deep way that in each woman it creates this distinctive politics, right? The distinctive political identity that we're not able to get at. So I think from my work in the international community that might be useful to talk about what I've seen is the way that the ideal of justice gets connected to democracy and where women fall into that, right? So if women are more democratic, if we have all these Tamil women in Sri Lanka who are nonviolent, who participate in US NGOs that support democracy, then we're fine to support Tamil women. But if they're Tamil women who have a different politics, who want separatism, who are not against the armed struggle, who are not against engaging in violence, then it's not something the US or anybody's going to support, right? It's only if you follow the Western way of understanding the way that women are supposed to operate. And the thing I hear all the time is that in countering violent extremism, they want a counter-narrative to radicalization. And then in the reconciliation rights perspective, they want a common narrative, right? In this conversation, you cannot get either of these. A counter-narrative, a common narrative between a Sinhalese woman and a Tamil woman. They've tried that. It doesn't work. It breaks down because one side wants to talk about alcoholism and the other side wants to talk about militarization. You cannot assume that women are going to be your pathway into reconciliation because they're more peaceful, because they're more democratic. It doesn't work on the island. So I'll let Kate talk about, a bit more about the transitional justice process. One of the things that I know is right now affecting Tamil women is the question of faith. Everyone talks about faith building, effective faith building. These are women who have seen UN desks in refugee camps, who have seen reporting mechanisms, who have gone to the LLRC over and over again. There's not even been one case prosecuted. So you can say sexual violence now is not as bad as it was in 2009, it's not as bad as 2011, but it's not been prosecuted. None of these cases have been prosecuted. So these women still exist. There was a reporter going there the other day who called me and said, no, but it's much better now for Tamil women. But if she's still living in the shadow of a rape from not that long ago, from 3 years ago, then that's going to define her entire life. Right? The way she thinks about where she goes and how she goes and whether she moves through military checkpoints. And the other thing I think that's really, really important is that for Tamil women now, forgetting is a way of survival. There is something very political about the act of forgetting, right? A lot of women who I've known who are fighters, you ask them now about the scars on their hand, and they'll say, I don't remember. I don't remember. And I believe them because the memory has no value. It's not useful for them to remember this. In their particular context, it's actually quite dangerous for them. So I'll end by just talking about the solutions that I've seen and some of my critiques of those solutions. Kate and I were at the Assistant Secretary of State Nisha Biswal's conversation at Columbia University's new U.S. Sri Lanka Forum. And her entire message was that lasting peace is linked to an inclusive prosperity. Over and over again, this is what she says. Lasting peace is linked to an inclusive prosperity. Again, this is sanitizing language, it is depoliticizing language, and the person who gets put in that position to create inclusive prosperity is the woman who you've given a sewing machine to. She's going to be the way the U.S. government can say, we've contributed to reconciliation in the United States. Right? And who are they partnering with at Columbia University? They're partnering with the Association of War Widows, whose big suggestion is to have a garment factory, one that I've seen that's outside of Batagaloa that's surrounded by military camps. Right? This is a U.S. approach. It is a sanitized approach to reconciliation. It is depoliticized. So, just coming out of recently, I went to a 4-day workshop hosted by NATO on women joining ISIS, and the entire thing was about radicalization. And, the end solution, again, the solutions we come back to with women was empowerment and education, right? We're not dealing with any of the other things. The fact that, women's empowerment also means that she doesn't live in a militarized context. This guy, I think he was the head of the Romanian counterintelligence, his solution was that we scan all little girl children. That's how you end radicalization, right? We know that this is where CVE and sexual violence overlap. We know that surveillance amongst women, amongst little girls, increases the risk of sexual violence, which increases the risk of radicalization, right? So these are the solutions that people are coming up with. For me, I think the diaspora it plays a really important role here. In between the international community and the Tamil population, you have the population on the island from the recent Pearl report saying that they want the international community involved, right? But you're also involved here on the other side that you can navigate that for the Tamil community. You get to be the person in between who can tell the international community, look, the violence within the community is not cultural. You can't call it cultural because this is not our culture. This is not what we do, right? You can say that this is not how we want to look at Tamil women. We don't want the ex-fighters being given beauty salons. We want them to be engaged politically. So the diaspora, I think, has a role there. And I'll just sort of end by saying that I think that we have to broaden the spectrum of accountability, particularly for women. If you look at sexual violence and the number of areas where sexual violence is coming from the community, from the state, from other forces, nobody talks about the role of the United Nations here. There is something very distinctive for women in the Congo, for women in Sri Lanka, from other places, when the violence comes from the United Nations, from peacekeepers who are supposed to protect them, that's going to affect how women see all of these processes. The UN is involved in a particular type of violence. So accountability has to include them. And I'll just end by saying that 2 weeks ago, I was with the women in the FARC in Colombia, the female fighters who fought in the movement for 30 years, and we happened to be there on the day that they signed the peace deal. And one of the leaders of the movement, and she's telling me about her political thoughts and why she joined. And in the process of this, there's an NGO that comes by to visit the house with the female fighters to offer them sewing machines. So, what I would say is that it sounds glib, but it's enough with the sewing machines. We have to allow Tamil women a political voice based on the experiences of violence that they've had.
Thank you, Numi. So, in the interest of time, I'm not going to summarize things and just leave the message. So, move on to the next speaker. So, the next speaker is Kate Cronin-Furman. Kate is the postdoctoral research fellow at the International Security Program, Harvard Kennedy School of Belfair Center, Science and International Affairs. Kate work appears in international journals and many on transitional justice, the Washington Post, the Monkey Cage blog, the Atlantic, the National Interest, New York Times, and many more. And she still writes blogs on wrong rights and justice in conflict. She had recently completed or working on a book?
Working on it.
Working on a book, Just Enough, The Politics of Accountability for Mass Atrocities, looks at when and how justice is delivered for atrocity crimes. It draws on her fieldwork in Sri Lanka and Dr. Congo. So Dr. Kate will speak on the topic, on her book topic, the politics of accountability for mass atrocities, and relating that to Sri Lanka, and she'll be addressing that. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I am both a human rights lawyer and a political scientist, but I think we have the kind of human rights activist and lawyer contingent amply represented here today. So commitments on the Truth Commission, which they've said will be coming down sometime late 2017, and the prosecutorial mechanism, which they're now saying will happen after that at some point. And what I'd like to address is the likelihood that these accountability mechanisms will deliver, that the Sri Lankan government will be able to put in place true transitional justice processes that will meet the needs of the victims and deliver accountability. I'm going to do that from my perspective of having looked at the accountability outcomes for approximately 90 different mass atrocities worldwide over the last half century. Because tabulating huge lists of things and coding them is what political scientists do for fun. So I have looked at quite a number of cases and been able to draw some conclusions about patterns in accountability outcomes. And what I find is that, as I'm sure is no surprise to anyone in the room, transitional justice only happens under a very specific set of conditions. Neither trials nor robust truth commissions are common after acts of mass atrocities. So when the state commits large-scale crimes against civilian populations, the perpetrators of those crimes never prosecute themselves. Absolutely never. We only see prosecution of atrocity crimes when there has been real regime change. They also almost never happen without strong and coordinated domestic demand. So the kind of classic examples of domestic prosecution for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for genocide, for instance, in Argentina, after the junta was dislodged and regime change occurred, they prosecuted, and that was largely the result of powerful domestic mobilization demanding justice. So one reason that we don't see these things without this kind of strong domestic mobilization is that prosecutions of war crimes are very costly, they're very time-consuming, and they're potentially very politically damaging. And one sort of unfortunate and paradoxical dynamic is that this is especially true in democracies. So in a democracy where a government is dependent on electoral support, they have to be very sure that the public is going to support a war crimes prosecution process. And what this means for the case of Sri Lanka is that this is exactly the kind of context where transitional justice is very, very challenging. Some obvious reasons for that. Perpetrators of these atrocities remain in power 7 years after the war's end. So of course, the international community has sort of certified the January 2015 election as regime change, but we know that many people remain in positions of power in both the civilian and military apparatus who are deeply implicated in the crimes that occurred in the final phase of the war. So that is one stumbling block to a real accountability process, and it's a big one. But I would argue that an equally problematic dynamic is the fact that the majority population opposes accountability. And again, this is an electoral democracy where people will vote on this issue. So in the Sinhala Buddhist South, people that make up the government's core constituency do not support an accountability process. And we've seen that even the OMP, the Office of Missing Persons, which is dramatically the least controversial of the 4 proposed mechanisms, was very contentious. Getting this legislation passed this summer was quite a difficult process. So the fact that that pillar of the kind of 4-pronged approach was already so difficult is indicative of how deeply politicized this issue is, and how much resistance there is to it in the South. So I'll say here that I am relatively agnostic about the sincerity of members of the government's commitment to transitional justice. I think it is true that there has been real political change in the South. It does appear to be true that some members of this government are committed to progress on accountability. We've seen enhanced international engagement. We even saw the foreign minister admit that the Channel 4 footage was accurate, that these crimes had occurred. So I don't make an argument here that there has been no change from the Rajapaksa regime, but what I would caution here is that despite that change, despite the possibility that certain individuals are committed to pushing a process forward, this is still a democracy with an electoral majority against accountability. Many people in the South simply do not believe that these atrocities occurred. When I have spoken to kind of everyday Sinhalese people in the South, they have repeatedly told me that this is fabricated, this is just to damage Sri Lanka's reputation internationally. There is real belief that these crimes did not occur. And consequently, they view any investigative process as essentially a witch hunt against people who they consider war heroes. Now, of course, we've seen the joint opposition trying to exploit this in order to bring the Rajapaksas and their affiliates back into power. And that is very concerning. Additionally, this government has repeatedly represented to the international community that they don't really have control over the military. That they have to move slowly on key issues of importance to the Tamil population in the Northeast because they cannot depend on the military to go along with what the civilian administration says. So because of these dynamics, basically the structural conditions that exist in Sri Lanka make transitional justice extremely politically risky, and I would argue unlikely. I do not expect to see domestic prosecutions anytime soon, and I also would be fairly skeptical of what the Truth Commission process will be able to achieve. From my research looking at other similar cases, what most often happens in contexts like this is instead sort of underpowered mechanisms, which of course Sri Lankan Tamils are very familiar with. We have, the 20 years of commissions that didn't really do anything, but are repeatedly created in response to pressure for human rights progress. So, unfortunately, this is a very pessimistic message on the basis of comparing Sri Lanka to other similar cases. And, I would add that because of these dynamics, which are extremely visible to the victim population, there is an additional complication here, which is that the victim community is losing faith in the process, as Nimi just pointed out. I was last in Sri Lanka 3 months ago in the Northeast speaking to members of the victim community about transitional justice and other issues, and all of them emphasized that they really didn't see the change in Colombo as relevant to their lives. They did not believe that the institutions being promised by the government were likely to deliver them anything better than the historical institutions had done. So the transitional in transitional justice means either regime change or a real transition from conflict to peace. In Colombo, it feels like both of these things have happened, right? Civil society, the press is much more free in the South. The checkpoints are gone. It feels both like a society at peace and a society that has transitioned towards democracy. In the Northeast, it feels like neither of these things are true. The military remains omnipresent throughout the region. It is very much not a post-conflict situation, but a situation where people feel they are in ongoing conflict. And the democratic gains of the elections of last year have not really been felt. Because of this, the crimes that occurred at the end of the war still feel very real and present to people. I heard from people that they were only just now reporting disappearances that had occurred in 2008, 2009. And what that should tell us is that people do not feel that there has been transition, that this is a post-conflict situation. People do not have faith that the change of the last 18 months is real or irreversible. Though at the same time, many of them do still express a hope for justice. So it is a very kind of unsettling situation in which they find themselves, where they are both deeply skeptical about this government's willingness to deliver and ability to deliver transitional justice, but at the same time, unwilling to give up. Nimi has said that for some women in the Northeast, forgetting is the only viable option, and I definitely have heard that from people, but from an equal number of people, I have heard the message that they will never forget, and they will continue fighting on this forever until they receive justice. What this means, unfortunately, is that activists in the community and activists in the diaspora have a very challenging mission to find a way to advocate for justice, to help bring accountability to this victim community in the presence of extremely challenging structural dynamics. And for me, on the basis of kind of what I laid out about the structural conditions that enable transitional justice, this means that the focus should be on changing the attitudes, particularly in the South, that preclude progress here. So, we've seen a lot of focus on getting international judges and international experts involved in the process. And that is very important to the victims as a minimum condition for faith in the process. But to me, that is a later concern. Because at the moment, the possibility of any real process is minimal. And so my kind of read of the situation is that the focus at this point must be on advocating for security sector reform in order to make possible prosecutions at some point, in the next 2 to 5 years, and most importantly, outreach to the majority population in the South. And I was very startled at how little of that was going on when I was there this summer. The support, or at least tolerance, of the Sinhala Buddhist community in the South for an accountability process will be critical to its success. So that, at this moment, I think is the single most important thing that can be done in order to enable progress. And what I think that means is that advocacy has to be focused on international actors, making that a priority, focusing on this kind of outreach, and a little bit away from the kind of technical elements of the transitional justice process. And I think I'm probably over time, so I'll let that.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. So I'll move on with the third speaker, which is Heather Ryan. Dr. Heather Ryan is an adjunct professor teaching international criminal justice and has served at Cambridge Tribunal Monitor at the Open Society for Justice Initiated. So she was managing the office there. She was also worked at the University of Denver, the Kerr School of International Studies, Open, and many other projects. Her specialty is in the area of management, development and execution of justice-related projects in the area of including international criminal justice, legal and judicial reforms, human rights investigations and compliance. So she has extensive experience managing the office during the Cambridge investigation. So she will speak on international justice mechanisms and how it's applicable to Sri Lanka, because also she will draw upon her experience on hybrid mechanisms and if there's any other possibilities that we can take forward from her experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to first express my appreciation of your ongoing commitment to the cause. Obviously, this is a group of people who remains activists involved and committed to helping the people in Sri Lanka, and that's to be credited. I just want to say a few things. This has been a little bit of a discouraging exposition, and I think that that is justified because I think the situation is very discouraging in many respects. And I agree with everything that both of the prior two speakers have said. I'm going to talk about things from a little bit different perspective, however, and maybe a little bit more technical, but hopefully to add a few things that can be done. As I've been introduced, I've worked for the last 10 years as a monitor of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. That was a tribunal that was not instituted until over 30 years after the atrocities were committed. So in some respects, that's a lesson of how long it takes to get to a point where transitional justice mechanisms can sometimes be initiated. Now, it's different in every respect, and I would certainly hope that it doesn't take 30 years in Sri Lanka, but it is a sort of object lesson in the need for getting a society to a political and social position, as Kate said, where justice is really on the agenda from the political perspective as well as from the social perspective. So, a few comments I'll make. I am a member, along with 5 other lawyers, of an organization called the Monitoring and Accountability Panel. And we were appointed by the transitional government of Tamal Alam to focus really on monitoring the efforts of the government and the efforts in Sri Lanka to develop transitional justice mechanisms, especially accountability mechanisms. So we are a group of people who have a variety of experience in international criminal justice mechanisms, and we are looking at what is the government and what are others doing to honor the government's commitment to establish some kind of an accountability mechanism. Now, all of these efforts came out of the fact that the High Commissioner for Human Rights instituted an investigation into gross human rights abuses in Sri Lanka, came out with a 125-page report on the horrific and extensive abuses on both sides of the conflict, and recommended that Sri Lanka engage in a comprehensive transitional justice program, which would include things like an office for disappeared, would include reparations, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also an accountability mechanism. And it's that accountability mechanism that I'm going to focus on. Now, I think it's important when we look at the High Commissioner's report, as well as there was and I hope I'm not sort of talking about things you already know well, but following the High Commissioner's report, the Human Rights Council of the UN issued a resolution that the government of Sri Lanka was a sponsor of. It was a unanimous resolution to institute a program of transitional justice, which would include these 4 mechanisms and include accountability mechanism. Now, but first it's important to recognize that the High Commissioner's report talked about the variety of problems to achieving a accountability mechanism that would garner the real trust and confidence of victims of the conflict. And most of those problems and most of the challenges that will be faced in Sri Lanka to creating any kind of accountability mechanism are very well known. First of all, there's the political will problem, and I think Kay talked about that very well. I think that we're getting a very mixed message from the government of Sri Lanka about whether or not a accountability mechanism in the form of a tribunal is realistic in the very near term for future. Second, there's a problem with a history of commissions and accountability mechanisms that have failed. And they failed for a variety of reasons. One of which, and is primary, is there's been a lack of independence and impartiality on those commissioners. The key to any accountability mechanism is that it be independent and impartial, that it make judgments based on the facts that are presented to it in an objective manner, not on a basis of political commitment or what side people come from. And there's not a history of that kind of independence and impartiality in Sri Lanka. A third implement to an accountability, or problem with an accountability mechanism is that these mechanisms, tribunals, are very complex. They apply principles of international law that have not been embodied in the domestic law of most jurisdictions and not in the domestic law of Sri Lanka. So they require a kind of expertise that is not available in Sri Lanka. And I think the conclusion of all of this is that victims in Sri Lanka do not have confidence that an accountability mechanism that is totally domestic is going to, in fact, provide justice to victims of these crimes. And that's a result of all of these issues, a lack of a history of these mechanisms, a lack of expertise, and a lack of independent judiciary, and minimum lukewarm political will. So for all these reasons, the High Commissioner's Office recommended a hybrid tribunal, which would have some domestic components and some international judges and prosecutors as well. Part of the reason for this is to add some expertise, but also primarily to assure victims that this is in fact going to be independent and fair. And without that, any tribunal is going to be just meaningless to the victim. And so what we need to do is figure out, is there a solution that will build the confidence of victims in its fairness, as well as actually being fair? So that was the recommendation of the High Commissioner. Now, in the Human Rights Council resolution that the government of Sri Lanka signed on to, there was a backing off away from that. They did not agree to a hybrid tribunal, which would be essentially half and half. They agreed to a domestic tribunal that would have some international participation. But it was very unclear from that Human Rights Council statement what that international participation would be. And we know from subsequent comments from the government of Sri Lanka that their view of that international participation is relatively limited, that they're looking toward international participation in the form of advisors, but not in the form of actual judges that sit on the court, or prosecutors, investigators, or others who are, in fact, in decision-making roles. Now, the group that I'm a part of, this group of experts, we were formed, I think, to provide some independent monitoring of the actions of the government for a couple of purposes. One, I think it's always good to have independent monitoring of what's happening. Not someone who has a stake in this, but somebody who can just talk about, based on the experience of the last 30 years of international criminal justice, is the government forming institutions that are likely to succeed and are likely to serve the needs of Tamil victims and other victims in Sri Lanka? So our goal is to look at that from an outside perspective. And that is a tool, hopefully for activists like you, to be able to use in your advocacy. And I think monitoring is always serves several purposes. One, it ensures that the process is transparent, but it also provides a tool for activists to use. Following this Human Rights Council resolution, which we regard as sort of a benchmark for is the government of Sri Lanka living up to its obligations with regard to transitional justice, there's been one additional meeting of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. That was in July. And I attended that, and the High Commissioner at the time issued a report, which was, I thought, very lukewarm. He acknowledged some progress by the government of Sri Lanka in forming a task force, in the establishment of the Office of Missing Persons, and some progress toward transitional justice, but essentially was relatively damning in terms of a demonstration by the government of Sri Lanka of real political will to have a meaningful accountability process. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, including the political reasons, that the government is, it feels that it can't do that and still hold on to power. It feels it does not have the control of the military it needs, and it feels it doesn't have the political backing to move forward aggressively in this respect. So it's difficult. But from an objective perspective, from the perspective of our monitoring group, very little has been done toward establishing an accountability mechanism. And what has been done is discouraging because of the expression that international participation is not necessary and a fully domestic tribunal would be appropriate. In our view, from the view of our experts, Sri Lanka, like many other countries coming out of a period of extensive conflict, does not have the capacity or the history of independent judiciary to handle a war crimes tribunal that would try the kind of atrocities that were committed. Now, given the problem with lack of real political will right now, the question is what can be done at this point? And, you know, it would be my belief that there still is, that advocacy is still important to keep this issue on the domestic and the political agenda, that this is something victims want and deserve and are entitled to. But there are other steps that can be taken too, and that pressure should be kept on. Just because there's no tribunal established doesn't mean that there can't be efforts to investigate certain actions, that there can't be efforts to collect and preserve evidence. The longer you wait for any of these tribunals, the more the evidence disappears. And so there are many steps the government could take, even though it may feel that it can't establish a tribunal with international participation right now. And those steps are steps that it's important, I think, for groups like this in the diaspora. The diaspora community in Geneva was very effective, I felt, when I was there last summer, and supporting those groups, supporting the groups in Sri Lanka who are working on the initial steps necessary to get to the point where an accountability mechanism will make sense, because at some point it will make sense. And it is an iterative process, though, where step by step you get to the point where it is just unacceptable anymore not to acknowledge the need for a tribunal. And so when we get to questions, I'm happy to answer any more questions about this, but I think what's really critically important to me when I read through the reports on the atrocities that have occurred, these are some of the grossest atrocities, you know, that have occurred in the last century. And accountability is the right of victims. So pushing for any mechanism that gains the confidence of victims is certainly an important and incredible goal.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you. Okay, let's move on with the fourth panelist, and much awaited talk from her and her presentation. As Dr. Navanitha Pillai, and she doesn't need any introductions, everyone knows in the room, but I'm obliged to carry on to give an introduction as a moderator. So Dr. Pillai was an international judge and former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for an extended period. She was the first woman to start a law practice in her home province of Natal in South Africa in 1967. She acted as a defense attorney for many anti-apartheid activists, exposing torture, helping to establish key rights for prisoners in Robben Islands, which everyone knows. She has also worked, or have extensively served as a lecturer as KwaZulu-Natal and also being Vice President of the Council of the Universities of Durban, Westfield. Dr. Pillai was an acting judge at the South African High Court, also have been judge of the International Criminal Tribunals in Rwanda, and also later appointed as the International Criminal Court in Hague. So she was behind challenging the working practice. The UN worked hard to build principle-based working within the basis of the Universal Declaration. She was very few of the leaders who have actually stood outside the politicization of the Council. And also she was the first UN leader to bring caste-based discrimination on the agenda of the UN.